Okay, let's take a look at this front view. And maybe we can get into some smaller aspects here of the construction. But I'm going to start with this same exact setup. Maybe start a little lighter this time, just so we have some, I don't have to worry about the layering and build it up a little bit more slowly. So here's going through my gesture, building the asymmetry between those rhythms, getting a little bit of a stretch on that side. There's that lean, that lift up on the left, lumbar spine, pelvis, weight. I'm going to say weight be on the right side, best guess. Here's some of those wrapping lines that we were talking about earlier. Out of the pelvis. This big rhythm for the femur, and then knee, and lower leg. And let that kind of sweep into the foot, and then that's done. We could double check the proportions just by looking at the head to pelvis and try to match that height from the pelvis to the ground or where the foot is. That way you don't have to set up your whole proportion chart. You could just kind of use that, bring it in when you think you might be off base or something. So there's that, and then this will use as our supporting leg, kind of push that rhythm back. Here's the knee, and then calf and lower leg back here, and then that's the back foot. So there's our figure. Now we have our arm this way. Here's the humerus, and then this comes out. So here's our forearm, and then hand. And I think on this one, we're going to take a closer look, not just at setting up the core areas of the figure. We'll take a look at the construction of those same building blocks, box, cylinder, form intersection, to start to think more about the hands and feet. So this arm is going away here, and then kind of come back and up. And hand would be up here. And that would be good enough, right, for the gesture to start. Now I'm going to do my tilt. So higher, weight shifts that up on the right. Rib cage kind of leans this way to counter it. Shoulders have their own lean. We could include that as well. Neck comes forward. Head counters that. Here's our weight leg here. Kneecap. And then weight kind of pushed up on the ball of the foot. So there's our ankle. Shapes are next. So here's my kind of my indications again for where I think my shapes are beginning and ending. These are my proportion markers where I think I'm going to land those eggs. So now after I have that, my basic width, trying to fit this ellipse in and think about the size. 1 head by 2, 1 head tall by 2 head wide, thinking about that roughly for that shape. And then rib cage here, just kind of outside the proportion. One thing I'll double check here visually is just making sure that the rib cage and pelvis shapes are the same width. So I just want to double check that, you know, one's not too much bigger than the other here. You could do that just by kind of dropping some lines down. Now I'm going to connect them. So we'd have our stretch and pinch, and making sure that those have that nice quality of overlap, wrap. So that's what's happening here. And then we're going to do the same thing. It's pretty clear on this side that this would be stretching. So that's our kind of S for that intersection. Wraps comes inside. This would be pinching, but it's kind of hidden by that arm. Let's draw it anyways. So let's put a little C there. And that will come down. Okay, now we're going to do our landmarks. Pit of the neck is here. We could do this kind of long throw for that symmetry line if that helps to just see that first, kind of just imagining the connection that would run through that sternum, belly button, pelvis. and then come back on top and be a little bit more careful with where you find those marks. So that would be my belly button, sternum. Sternum's about just roughly a head tall. So that would be kind of that necktie shape. And then we talked about the 10th rib as part of this thoracic opening, slightly thinner on women. And then we could add clavicle as well. So that would be the clavicle raising there. And then I'm going to do my little straight or S-curve, either one. And that will be coming out this way. So a little bit higher on this side because that arm's raising is all. So one thing that's kind of interesting, if we would narrow our discussion just to that area for a moment. So what I mentioned prior was that you shouldn't confuse the perspective of your rib cage for that of the shoulder, especially from the front. So the tilt of the rib cage and the perspective of the rib cage can be different than what's going on in the shoulder. So while I probably wouldn't do this for the back, it can be useful for the front sometimes to try to describe the shoulder as having its own perspective. So the way that I would do that is I'll think of a relationship line across the clavicle and then drop that down about halfway down the sternum and almost going to build like a bridge. So it comes in, walks across that egg, and then drops back down the other side. So this form, kind of like shoulder pads that a football player might wear, it becomes a separate or a secondary structure that, if you would like, you can use to help explain the difference in perspective between rib cage and shoulder. So let me give you an example in 3/4. So let's say over here we have a similar rib cage, doesn't have to be the same, but let's say this is our egg, here's our cut for that neck, here's the sternum, and then the opening of the thoracic arch. So we could use this tilt line. I would always kind of balance it or position it over the sternum there, and then the shoulders do have a different lean than the rib cage. So if we go back to thinking about the profile of the figure, just think about the leans. So we have rib cage definitely going this way because of the thoracic spine. Neck goes forward, head oftentimes the opposite. The shoulders might have a natural lean forward a bit more so than the rib cage. And this can be a confusing thing to separate oftentimes. So it's worth double checking yourself. If you think you're, really above the rib cage, remember my rule is that from the front, I generally try to show that we're underneath the rib cage, just to keep that counterbalance of the spine and the perspective. But there are circumstances or there are views where it looks like we're above. And that can happen. You could be a bird's eye view and be above somebody. But more often than not, it's the top of the shoulders that we're seeing, right? So if we come back to that, that's why most of the time I would drop the shoulders this way. So those would be these lines. Bring that across. Wrap it. So I'm just doing another form intersection. I'm building a box on an egg. Egg is the primary form. This is the subordinate form. Then I'm doing a depth. This depth would represent the width of the shoulder. And go across. Back. That's the same depth. And then down. So this would be called the shoulder girdle. So that would be kind of a more, it's a secondary perspective, but it would be something that you could use to develop and advance your construction studies even more. And then we took this a little bit more just to give you, kind of complicate it. What this sets up for later is now you have 1, 2, 3 planes that would represent the clavicle, acromion, and scapula. And those are really important and complicated areas around the arm. So having those 3 planes is really useful for seeing the anatomy and positioning it around the top of the shoulder. The other thing you could do with this is it has a gesture. So, you can move the entire shoulder structure if the arm's raising. So if it's easier for you to think about, this side of the arm as a whole unit or a block raising, I think of that coming up. and then translate that to 3D or your construction form. I use that all the time. I just think it's really useful to edit this area to those planes. And then this could be, maybe in another example, we do a quick one down here. Like let's say we have that same one, but on this side, because the arms don't have to do the same thing from each side, maybe this can pull forward, or just that one side. So that might look like this. But it's easier for me to understand and try to draw that while I'm moving that whole block, as opposed to, I don't know, a clavicle, a scapula, all that. But you could also use these lines to say, well, that is the clavicle, this is the acromion, that is the scapula. So it just helps me to think about how to frame around the rib cage. So that might be too much, but it gives you a bit more insight into how you could further subdivide some of these areas in their construction for greater clarity with your perspective. Okay, so let's go back to like a broader view. You have our landmarks. Let's just be a little clearer with as is here. So that's the point of the pelvis, point of the pelvis. More that I look at this, I think I might have put the tilt opposite to the photo, but that's okay. Quick landmarks for legs. So 2/3 of the way down, that's where the great trochanter would be. We have that. We have our patella for the knee. This would be the tibia. Fibula is back here. That's our ankle. And then we'll talk about the foot in a second. Arms. Probably don't really need to do much in terms of landmarks now because they're not instrumental as to how I'm putting cylinders over. But it's not a bad idea just to get familiar with the bones, practicing the names or developing a shorthand in terms of how you want to pattern them in your drawing. So that arm's done. Here would be the humerus. Remember that little triangle on the inside is the funny bone. And then here would be the radius ulna. And then hand. Okay, let's turn that down so that it doesn't compete with our, there we go. And now let's just build some perspective. Let's see that in a different color. Okay, so hopefully by now it should be pretty easy. I'm going to relate these 2 points. So connect your dots. That's the width. This is the height. So from the front, I always bring the height to bottom of the pit of the neck. Anything above that would be the neck. Bring that across. So that would be the width of the front. So these landmark points register for me with the width of that plane. Here would be the bottom. So just hatching that in so you could see. And then side, which is, to me, again, what I'm thinking of this as doing is carving that egg down. So think of your pencil as more of like a sculptural instrument. So you have the egg. The egg was a better form to solve harder problems, proportion, tilts, things like that. Things I wouldn't want to use a box for because it requires more labor, let's say. And now that those issues are solved or reconciled, then I could just start customizing that shape. So this would be my front and side. And so now I have a plane change, this to that. Pelvis will be the same. So you can double check, because width, does that look proportionate to the front of the rib cage? Good enough. And then rib cage tilt went this way, and we're underneath. Now pelvis is going to go the opposite way. I'm going to put you above so that we maintain the perspective asymmetry of the spine. So depending on how you feel about this as a moment in your drawing, the construction stage, it can be something that you get good at and then just kind of skip through and get what you need from it and move on so that your anatomy or your lighting or your drapery is better. Or it's something that you could linger at in kind of the same way Renaissance artists would, and in their interest in dissolving the figure into architectural forms and patterns. Dissolving figures into a geometry can be a kind of a fun and weird design exercise. And that's something that you could see quite a bit in Michelangelo's sketchbooks or Da Vinci sketchbooks, where the column of the throat becomes a pillar, or the rib cage in some of Michelangelo's drawings becomes the dome of a cathedral. And I have lectures on that in my YouTube if anybody's interested in learning more about that. Much more boring, much less drawing, but it would be an interesting place if you do like this to spend more time thinking. I guess more conceptual reasons that you would do this. So those are done. Now we can put in some cylinders. Let's practice with those a bit more. So this one is going to be, I'm going to open that up a bit, this cylinder, and then I've made my arm a little too long. So I think I need to cut it up. Let's put it here. So it doesn't look as foreshortened in the way that I've staged it there. So I'm just going to subtract and make that cylinder a little shorter. And that will be here. And then this forearm is going back this way. So it's going to do the same thing, move that in. Okay, so those would be my lower arm. So on this one, we did that's new is maybe the shoulder girdle, which is this, and then, but that was still just box with a hole taken out of it. Then the hands, which has still been boxes, spheres, cylinders. But let's like I said, let's put in our arm. So this one looks like it's maybe a little bit more in than I had it originally. So I'm going to change that angle a bit. End at the bottom of the rib cage. So here's this. Now that you have this appreciation for the shoulder girdle, look how maybe you could add that here. Maybe you could even do it in a smaller way. Maybe you just build like a little ledge here. Something that goes back and behind the rib cage could be a good way to indicate for that scapula. Sometimes I'll do this. Just build a really thin structure for your shoulder girdle. Doesn't have to be that big monstrous cage if you didn't like it. But thinking of these three planes in one, I think is really useful. And you'll get a lot from it. And then if you ever draw animals, that shoulder girdle, it just gets distorted into what like Kent Holmgren or Jack Ham or Joe Weatherly will describe as the tombstone shape, which is the perspective placeholder for the scapula, the humerus, and the elbow. And then that would sit right in front of the rib cage. And then each animal could have a slightly different design. Like a horse might be more triangular, cat might be more rounded, cow might be more of like a tombstone. Okay, and here's the forearm. Just going to keep these as cylinders. And then that's just above the hip. So that ends, and then you could just cap this hand to that side there. But this is even how, my thinking of anatomy would progress. When I'm drawing muscles or more organic parts on a person, I'm not really drawing a muscle, I'm just drawing different shapes that I can visualize as having a bit of a perspective that then get developed and welded onto the existing forms on top. That's just another form intersection. So it's the exact same thing as everything that we've done. Like, if I'm dealing with the throat, I would build another little half cylinder to start to develop the windpipe and some of the hyoid and planes of muscles that are on the front of the throat. But that's just stacking one little cylinder on top of the intersection that we made. And then the figure just develops and develops from there. So let's hatch these just so we have our side pelvis, then top pelvis. Let's cut this forehead down a bit. Head construction is the same. It's just kind of the combination and development of planes. And now let's do some legs. So here let's start this with a cylinder. Let's just work on this front leg. Cylinder, that's like the easiest generic placeholder perspective for the direction of a limb. And then we could develop it. We could maybe subdivide this one. So there's a decent, halfway decent cylinder. Now, what else could we do with this? Well, I can kind of see the knee. So let's isolate the landmarks of the knee in that. Okay, so that's where that ends. Maybe I'll just pull that up, and that gives me an easy box. Now the whole of the femur exists with a top, an outside, an assumed back, and inside. So we'd have these. And then, like I was, we talked about on the last drawing, drop that plane down. That this becomes like a diagonal plane off that open-faced box there, and that's where your knee can exist. So you could put your patella there, or you could develop your, if you're doing more anatomy stuff, you could put your fat or your ligament or that kind of structure there. But here let's make another cube for the knee in this one. Maybe you struggle with knees and you need to put more emphasis on how that little part or area works. And then once I have that, it sets me up nicely to do the lower leg. Because now the leg from upper leg to knee to the lower leg, it's not twisting enough where I would lose the continuity of those planes and their progression. So here, if I wanted to just set up the shaft of the tibia, maybe I could drop two C-curves. That could go down, this could go down. And now I've planed off that front of the tibia. And this would be, remember we talked about it earlier, this would be my gold bar principle. This is thin, that has to get thick in the back. So that would be here.